excited to be here. Looking forward to having I hope, a bit of an interactive conversation with you all about a very serious issue. One that I think is critical to not only the work that you all are doing, but critical to the success for us as a nation, which is race. And in many ways, it's deeply connected to the work that you all do on a regular basis, which is how do we get to the communities that we all want to have? And in many ways, it's just that simple. So my task in the next 45 minutes to an hour is to talk to you a little bit about the complexity of race in its many forms, and to think about really the simplicity of what it means for us to be taking action to get to different outcomes. Before I do that, I do want to thank folks. I especially want to thank the folks with purpose-built communities, and I want to call out Aton in particular. I got to say a shout out to Danny Choi for the invite today, to Shirley, and to Shoshona, who I believe is in the room, but has been really helpful in just making sure that like my mic is on. So let me take a minute and start out by talking a little bit about what racial inequity looks like in the United States. Race is a difficult conversation, as we all know. I know that yesterday, I wasn't here, but I know that there was you all got a chance to watch some clips on the Central Park 5, got a chance to have a little bit of conversation about race, or at least it came into the room. And one of the things we think is absolutely central in the work that we do is actually bringing that conversation in and normalizing it. And part of normalizing it is actually naming what the problem is. And so if we think about racial inequity in the United States, it turns out that you can think of any key social economic indicator in the United States, and race is a central factor or the central factor in outcome in 2015, right? Doesn't matter, you pick it, education, jobs, housing, criminal justice, you pick it, and the truth is, race is still the single largest determinant in outcome. Many folks will say, well, what about class? Turns out that race is the largest determinant for class in the United States. You with me? The other piece that I think is important to mention is that while we know these disparities are huge across all of these indicators, they track the same nationally. So it doesn't matter, a lot of my work was out of the Northwest, out of Seattle in particular. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Seattle, or we're talking about Fort Worth, or we're talking about New York, or we're talking about Alabama. The reality is that those disparities look largely the same. And we're going to talk about today why. The other reality is that we are rapidly moving in this moment to a majority-minority country. So not only do we have these profound disparities, but we also are going to end up within a country very shortly, by 2040, in which the majority of us are deeply affected by those disparities. So what does that look like? We've seen race play in this last year in a whole bunch of different ways, right? It's been front and center in national media. So at its most profound and devastating in the last few months, what we've actually seen is, the Charleston massacre. And while that is profound when we think about the nature of how race plays in the US, the truth is that people of color are dying in the United States every day, but mostly in a slow and silent way. This is for King County in Washington, where Seattle is. Depending on your zip code, there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. One of the most profound things that came out of the Ferguson study, though, is that in Ferguson, depending on your zip code, the life expectancy difference is 30 years, right? 30 years. So we know, again, doesn't matter what we're talking about in terms of success in life, race is central. I want to hold that for a second, and I want to talk a little bit, I'm just going to share a little bit about me. And I was joking with Danny about this. In the last few months, for some reason, I feel like whenever I'm on stage, I have to share this, which is I identify as black. Rachel Dolezal has made us light-skinned black folks very complicated. Yes, right? In the last year. But I identify as black because, in fact, I'm black, just so y'all know. So this is my parents. The picture on the left is about a year and a half into my parents' marriage. They met in the 1950s. Picture on the right is about 4 years ago. My father passed away just this summer, just a couple months ago. And I shared that. He's part of the reason that I do this work. That large-headed child in the middle is my older brother. And he's, well, all I can say is just imagine that coming at you for, 18 years, that face. But I adore him. But my parents met. My father's actually from Tuskegee, Alabama, born and raised. And he's a sort of old-fashioned race man. Went to Tuskegee University, joined the military and Air Force, left the South at 22, and never came back. Very purposely never came back, never returned to the South. Met my mom while he was stationed in Scotland. My mom's actually born and raised in Edinburgh. And so my dad sort of, really clear about race and identity. And my mom came from sort of a long line of labor activists. And so I always say I came by this work fairly honestly, right? And so I had a pretty good understanding of race, but I don't think I really sort of understood the depth of it until I was about 15 years old. How many folks here are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments? Many folks. So Tuskegee syphilis experiments went on for 50 years. It was an experiment conducted by the federal government to look at the long-term effects of syphilis on a group of black men in Tuskegee. They told them that they were treating them, and in fact, they were giving them placebos to watch what happens when somebody dies a slow, horrific death from syphilis. So my great Uncle James was part of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And when I was about 15, we got a check from the federal government and a letter, an apology, like our bad, right? And because it was a small amount of money in the first place and they had split it up, check was like for $34 and something cents. And so, like I said, I had an understanding of what race was, but this I couldn't quite hold. I didn't understand it. I was like, how is this possible? Right? I mean, let's get this straight. It's a federal experiment, but it included the state of Alabama, the county of Macon, and ultimately even Tuskegee Institute itself. So literally, there were thousands of people over a 50-year period of time, and no one could find it in themselves to just simply say, this is wrong. It's like, how is that possible? So, holding that for a second, I'm going to ask you to do something with me. Promise we will come back to it. I want to talk to you about math. Will you do me a favor and pick a number between 1 and 10? Don't tell anybody. Got your number? Multiply that number times 9 and take your time. I got this wrong the first time. It turns out it's been a while since I looked at my multiplication tables. So take your time. You got your number? Okay. If that's a 2-digit number add them together. So for example, if it was like 32, it'd be 3 plus 2 equals 5. So you want to come back to a single digit. A single digit. You got it? Minus 5. Subtract 5 from that number. Got your number? Okay, now I want you to convert that number into a letter. So A would be 1, B would be 2. You with me? Got your letter? Okay, now thinking of your letter, think of a country that starts with that letter. Got it? Okay. Think of the last letter in your country's name. I know this goes on for 45. This is the entire thing right now. But it would be. That'd be kind of funny if it was, right? No, so last letter of your country's name. Got it? Think of an animal that starts with that letter. Okay. Last one. Last letter in your animal's name. Think of a fruit, and I'm not being good. Think of a fruit that starts with that letter. Got it? Okay, so how many folks are thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges? Raise your hand high. Yeah, So, I have to say, this is always, I love this part, right? So it turns out if you're working for racial equity, you get special powers. So it's a good reason to work for racial equity. No, it doesn't. So what just happened there? Anybody know? How'd that work? So the math. Yes, turns out the math was a distraction, like so many things in life, right? So you should have ended up, everybody in the room should have ended up with the number 4, right? If you didn't, you, like me, you got your math wrong. So if you ended up with the letter number 4, it means you started with the letter D. So let me ask you this question. How many countries start with the letter D? No? Yeah. Give me one. Dominican Republic. Djibouti, that's my favorite right there in North and Central Africa. So it turns out there's 4. There's Dominican Republic, Dominica, Djibouti, and Denmark. So if we all right now were sitting in the Caribbean, which would be nice, and I said, think of a country that starts with the letter D, do you think we'd all say Denmark? Probably not. We were sitting in Central Northern Africa, and I said, hey, what country starts with the letter D? Do you think we'd say Denmark? Probably not. But it turns out that in this example, so we know bias is at play, but it turns out in this example that 70 to 90% of people in the United States will say Denmark, kangaroos, oranges. So hold this with me, though. So even if we give ourselves the Denmark bias, how many animals start with the letter K? Koala, right? Kingfish, well over a dozen. So give ourselves that. How many fruits start with the letter O? That was I had to Google this one. Like, oh. Turns out olives are fruit. Turns out that there's at least a half a dozen. So what it turns out is 70, 90% of us actually say Denmark, kangaroos, oranges, to a set of questions in which there's over 1 million possibilities. Over 1 million answers to this set of questions. And yet 70 to 90% of us say Denmark, kangaroos, oranges. Because it turns out that even when we think we're starting with our own idea, that there is a whole set of culture, history, institutional policy and practice and structure that drives us repeatedly to the same outcome, again and again. So when we all think about that whole set of racial inequity, when we think about how is it possible that thousands of people can be involved in a 50-year-long process watching people slowly die, how is it that we're all complicit in the outcomes that we see in race today? Denmark, kangaroos, oranges. You with me? So, let me stop for a second and share a little bit about, just for a moment, about the Center for Social Inclusion. Well, I should just say this about me. I mentioned Charleston. Charleston was really powerful for me this year. My earliest work in the Northwest was part of an organization called the Coalition for Human Dignity, and we tracked neo-Nazis and skinheads. And it turns out in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a boom in neo-Nazi activity in the Northwest. All of it culminated ultimately in the death of a couple of folks, including an East African immigrant, Mulugata Sarah, and that led to the largest civil rights lawsuit in the nation's history, and actually shut down one of the largest Aryan nations organizations in the country at the time. And tension then started to fade from it. And I share that to say sort of that's what brought me into this work, but to recognize that as profound, again, as Charleston was, as profound as sort of the rise, and I hope you all know this, like the neo-Nazi party in the United States is at an all-time high, right? Since Obama's come into office, the explosion in hate speech, hate groups has been escalating year by year. But all of that sits within a larger context, a larger conversation about what does race mean in the United States. And so that's part of the work that we do for the Center for Social Inclusion is what does this story, this narrative, these outcomes mean for us as a nation, and what's the possibility of different outcomes? And so Eitan mentioned some of this. We actually really look at just three things: ideas, leadership, and communications. And the ideas are sort of what are the policy options that we have that could get us to different outcomes? And I know that's part of the conversation that you all have on a regular basis. Communications is what we're doing now in its simplest form. Like, what does it mean for us to have an honest conversation about race in the United States? We test that, though. So one of the things we're interested in is how does that play when we bring race into conversations around policy? And then the last piece is around leadership development. How do we actually create leaders who are capable of having this conversation in a way that's courageous and gets us to different outcomes? I will say this about race, because it's just such a profound piece as we have this conversation. It turns out that, because we're going to spend a minute talking about, we're not talking about individuals. When we talk about race, we frequently think of bad people, especially when we talk about racism. But we're not just talking about individuals. But we think in this conversation that it's really important to be able to define our terms. And race is a tricky one. So, both Summer in talking about her story made me think about this, and Alice and I had a great conversation at the table just about how uncomfortable we are with the conversation around race. It turns out that the construct of race is so profound. Actually, I've done testing on this. Put somebody in a chair, hook them up to an EKG, test their bodily sort of response, and then just get them to say the word race, just that, race. Heart rate goes up, perspiration increases, literally causes a physical reaction for most folks in the United States. And at the same time, if you ask those same people, what is race? Most of them will stare at you blankly, right? We've got this construct that causes us universal stress, and yet most of us don't share even a common definition of what it is. So, holding that, race is a construct. It's not biological. It's a modern idea, been constructed in the last 400 years here in the United States. I share this because I know everybody in this room is like, of course, I knew that. Truth is, 1 in 3 Americans believes race is genetic. 1 in 3. If you believe there is a genetic difference based on race, then it's very easy to defend why there is such a huge difference in outcomes based on race in the United States. If there is not one, then in fact, it begs a different set of questions. Policy drives the social construction of race. This piece is really important. We are here today with this set of outcomes by a specific set of policy, practice, and culture. that has driven us to these set of outcomes. Used this example before. You can find it, thinking about purpose-built communities, you can find it in any city in the United States. You will find, major city, you will find a highway that cuts the city in half. One side of that highway is guaranteed to be much darker than the other, much poorer than the other, right? And that was done by federal policy and practice. Ghettos didn't just happen, they were created by policy and practice. Last one, really important in this, we didn't choose this system. These are just 3 basic facts about race we think are critical to hold. Nobody in this room chose this. We didn't get a vote for it. But we most certainly collectively have a responsibility for a different set of outcomes. So want to take a second and talk about racial equity. And I keep using that word. And again, so important to think about defining our terms. And so wanted to take a second and talk about the difference between equity and equality. So everybody here has been to a sporting event or to a show, some kind of major event to attend, and like halftime comes or intermission comes, we all file out, and where do we go? Bathroom, right? So what's the difference in that experience for men versus women? Yeah? Okay, so for the women in the room, how much longer is the wait? How much longer is the line? 3 times? 5 times, right? It's significant, right? How many restrooms in those facilities for men versus women? Equal. They are the same. Half of us are men, half of us are women. Half the restrooms are for men, half the restrooms are for women. Only problem is it turns out that experientially, very different outcomes, right? It turns out how women use restrooms is different. It turns out who designed restrooms is different. So when we think about equity, equity is really just trying to apply a little bit of common sense and justice to a situation. And so across the country, you now have folks who, architects who are like, well, why don't we just build like 2 women's restrooms for every 1 men's restroom? Or even better yet, why don't we do family-style restrooms that are open to everybody? So really, just a little bit of common sense, a little bit of justice, different outcome. But the reason I like that example, for the men in the room, what are we doing while women are waiting? What's that? Waiting, right? We are actually waiting on our daughters. We're waiting on our partners. We're waiting on our mothers. We're waiting on our sisters. We are waiting. We may be having a beer and joking about it while we're waiting, but we are actually waiting because it turns out that when a system is out of balance, no one's benefiting from it. Just some of us are paying a higher cost for it, right? You with me? So when we talk about equity and racial equity, what's really important is a couple of things. One, when we talk about racial equity, we're just saying race is no longer a determinant of life outcomes. That in addressing racial inequity, we improve outcomes for everyone, including white people. One of the great challenges in the United States is when we say race, white people think we're not talking about them. White is a race. In many ways, in fact, white is the only race. It's how we got to this conversation in the first place. Second piece, racial equity is both our lens and our outcome. Really important that when we talk about equity, it's both we want a different outcome, but we also want a different process, a different way of actually thinking about how we get to collective outcomes that benefit us all. So I'm going to take just a second to talk to you about a couple more terms. How many folks here are familiar with the term implicit bias? Few folks. I think this is important, again, in terms of our understanding of how race plays, especially at the individual level. So explicit bias, we all know that, right? That's expressed directly. Like an example of an explicit bias that's given here is, I like white people more than I like Latinos. Conscious, just stated. How most of us think of bias. Implicit bias is expressed indirectly, and it happens actually at the subconscious level. And it's when somebody comes into a room and sits further away from a group of Latinos. But if you ask them if they did that, they would say, no. And they'd be sincere. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Let me pop back. Let me share a couple of examples. This is really important because it's a hard thing for us to hold because we have such deep commitment to the idea of individual identity, even though, as we saw with Denmark kangaroos and oranges, that's not actually how we really think. So it turns out that our subconscious mind is very much a dominant space for us, how it plays in our understanding of the worlds around bias. So I will give you this example. So it turns out that up until the 1980s, we couldn't find any talented female musicians for orchestras. They just weren't out there. You know, we were looking, but we just couldn't find them. And so someone came up with a really simple idea, which was, what would happen if we put a screen up between the tester and the person playing the instrument? And then overnight, we suddenly found all these talented women, right? So, literally overnight, 25 to 46% of hires were suddenly women. This experiment was so profound that what they found is that if the tester could hear the footsteps of the person who was about to play coming into the room, that it made as much as a 10% difference in who they actually hired. This one is actually an example around race. So the picture on the left says a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And the picture on the right says 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. If we asked these writers if they had racial bias, what would they say? No. Not me. Some of my best friends are, right? We know this to be true. And the truth is, they wouldn't be being, again, this is the tricky part, it's what makes it complicated. They wouldn't be insincere. So, what's bias? Well, before even saying that, let me just say this about bias. Just again, because it's a hard one to hold. Every second, we are taking in 11 million bits of information. Every second. And every second, we're conscious of 40 of them. You with me? 98% of our emotional cognition is in our subconscious. We are only conscious of 2% of it. So if you say, like, you know, I'm feeling X, chances are you're probably wrong, which is profound. So it's really important for us to hold that as we have these conversations, that much of how we're thinking about issues of race are playing for us as a set of tapes, if you will, in the back of our mind. So as we think about bias, one of the things that's come out of the last decade of research around the human mind, and we've learned so much in the last 10 years about how the human brain works. But one of the things that's most profound is that it turns out that suppressing bias actually makes it worse. So it turns out that, like, if you say love sees no color, it actually makes it more likely for you to see color. And it turns out actually the best way to deal with our bias is to embrace it, is to hold it, is to interrogate it, is to investigate it, is to be clear when we walk into a room and we find ourselves not sitting next to whatever group, to ask ourselves why. So, just quickly, it turns out that that idea of bias is also playing for us institutionally, not just individually, right? So this is an example from the top. It says institutional explicit or conscious bias, then institutional implicit or unconscious bias, individual explicit and individual implicit. These are all examples from policing, and have done a lot of work with police departments around the country. These were actually developed by police officers. So the institutional explicit example is a police department refusing to hire people of color. Up until 1970s, that was just the truth. That's how it worked. That was policy and practice. It is the context that everything else sits in. You with me? It's now illegal. The institutional, implicit, or unconscious example is police departments focusing on street-level drug arrests. And this one always throws people. Why would that be a form of unconscious bias? Anybody? Anybody? Please. Street arrests are mostly people of color. That's exactly right. So it turns out folks of color are more likely to use and sell drugs on the street. But it also turns out that people of color and white people sell and use drugs at the same rate, right? Universally. So not that anybody in here would know. But where do white people buy and sell drugs? At home. Turns out white folks are much more likely to buy and sell drugs behind closed doors. So if you focus on street-level drug arrests, you're going to arrest people for selling and using drugs. You're just going to arrest a whole bunch of black and brown folks who sell and use drugs. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of problems with street-level drug sales. Not trying to make this simple. It's just to acknowledge the fact that that has a pretty profound bias. And if you walked into our prison system anywhere in the United States, you would see what that looks like, right? So Nick's example is individual explicit, police officer calling someone an ethnic slur while arresting them. This is what we think of when we think of racism in the United States, right? Problem is that it's a pretty narrow slice of the pie about how race is actually playing for us nationally. And the final one is individual implicit, police officer calling for backup more often when stopping a person of color. And if we ask that officer, do you do that? The officer would say, no. And again, they'd be sincere. And in fact, we have. And they don't believe it until they see the data, right? So just to acknowledge the fact that as we think about how we want to create change, that one of the things that we think is so important to name is that we hold that this, a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur while arresting them, is everything that we need to know about race. And in fact, there is so much more occurring, and even more importantly, that we deeply believe that the leverage for change is not at this point, it's up here, right? Again, the reason we all said Denmark, kangaroos, oranges is because in your school, by the time you graduated from high school, you probably heard the word Denmark 200 times and in 200 different contexts. Institutions drive understanding. The structures around us drive the way we perceive the world. I'm going to give you a couple examples because I think it's really important. First one I'm just going to share is that I'm a smoker. I was waiting for the booze. I don't say that with any pride. It's horrible addiction. I have not been able to shake it. But we've made a lot of change around smoking in the United States in the last few decades. And the piece that I would share is change can happen. It can happen quickly if we're clear about our approach. And smoking is a great example. So to hold how great of an example that is that if I'd have said, I'm a smoker 15 years ago, rather than getting concerned and dirty looks from you all, a third of you would have said, join you at the break, that's it. And if I had said I'm a smoker 30 years ago, I'd be smoking right now, right? And I'd be happy, I'm just being honest, I'd be happy about it, but I would be smoking in this space. My first doctor's visit when I was 5 years old, the doctor and my mom had a cigarette while talking about my health, right? We've seen change happen and change happen really quick when we're clear about it and when we take a particular approach. So I want to talk about that approach. Anybody here remember the first big anti-smoking campaign in the United States? 1980s. Anybody remember the woman smoking out of the tray? Oh, right? Yeah. It was powerful, but it really didn't change much. Didn't actually change the number of smokers in the United States very drastically at all. Who's the audience for those commercials for that campaign? Smokers. And it turns out that as a smoker, I am much more aware, if you've never smoked, trust me, I have a better understanding of how damaging smoking is than you do. I feel it every day. So it turns out I'm not smoking because I think it's good or that it's not bad for me. I'm smoking because it's an addiction. So second great campaign comes around in the early 1990s, and this time it focuses on a brand new idea, and it's called Truth. It was the program, but what was the element that it focused on? Secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke. You with me? Remember that? It's actually the first time that we had actually even framed it that way. Who's the audience? Non-smokers. Turns out that focusing on non-smokers created an opportunity to think about things in a very different way. Could actually have a national education campaign focused on institutions like children. Turns out that was really effective because today, if like I'm smoking outside and like a third grader walks by, they mock me, right? There's no, right? But it allowed us to drive down into a deeper level into thinking about institutions and education. It also turned out that focusing on non-smokers, because that was the majority, that it actually allowed us to change a whole bunch of policy and practice. To the point today that if I want to have a cigarette almost anywhere in the country, I have to be 25 feet from the closest door, right? And do you believe that there's a difference whether I was 15 feet or 25 feet from the door for your health? I can tell you there's not. It turns out that I'm 25 feet from the closest door because I'm supposed to understand my behavior is completely unacceptable. It is not welcome. And guess what happened to smoking in the last 2 decades? Declined drastically. So if we think about how we get to change, if we focus on policy, practice, culture, if we were to drive home this idea that a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur while arresting them, that if you were that cop, you have to stand 25 feet from the closest door, I guarantee you we'd see a change in behavior. You with me? So really thinking about what those opportunities are in policy and practice can generate very different outcomes. Very quickly, few more terms, promise to go through them quick. Individual racism, again, this is typically how we think about individual racism, prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual, right? Institutional racism. I can guarantee you, go back into your organization, anywhere, and you ask folks, do you care about racial equity? Is that a value to hold? 90%, there's a few folks out there not with us, but 90% of people will raise their hand. And if you ask folks in your organization, are we effective at addressing this? You'd be lucky if you get 10%. So again, how is that possible, right? Structural racism just is acknowledging that we sit in a context, a history, culture of race, and that all of our institutions are interacting with each other, driving outcomes that are wildly different based on race. Easiest way to hold these 3 ideas, we're all sitting in this room, all of us have bias. If we act on those biases, we are discriminating. If we were to think about this institution here in the Hilton, it has a set of policy and practice that is either moving towards greater equity or away from it. It's only 2 directions. And if we were to pan back from the Hilton and take in the entire skyline of Fort Worth, we would understand that all of those institutions and organizations are interacting with each other, driving outcomes. With me? How do we get to change? 3 simple ideas. Normalize, operationalize, organize. We need to normalize the conversation around race. We've got to be able to talk about it the way we would anything else that is this serious, right? Like we just did about smoking. We've got to be able to operationalize in our organization's culture, policy, and practice changes. And we've got to organize other folks to actually help us make this change. So I'm going to cover this really quick, and I apologize, but I'm conscious of time. This is just to acknowledge how race functions in our national narrative, and it is a central narrative to our understanding of what it means for us to be Americans. Implicit bias, we talked about what that is. In the national narrative, what happens is we're all taught not to talk about race, so in fact what we use is a whole bunch of stuff around symbolic race and symbolic racism, which then triggers our implicit bias, which is how we get to such complicated, messy conversations, and part of the reason why people actually break out in sweat when you ask them to say the word race. Great example of this, just very quickly, is our entire conversation this summer around the Confederate flag, right? Confederate flag is a single idea, image, or word that triggers for everybody in this room a whole set of very complex narratives around race and what it means for us to be American. And it happens in a whole bunch of ways. When we say gentrification, for everybody in this room, the reality is we are saying race, right? When we say welfare, we are saying race. Only piece I want to name on this is that it's really important that we talk about what those things are in order to get the different outcomes. We do a lot of work with local government, and one of the things that we think is really important is that our national narratives around who we are as identity really do two of the sort of national meta-narratives is this idea of personal responsibility and the whole conversation around limited government. And both of those ideas are deeply steeped in our ideas of race. They are, in fact, part of the reason why they're part of our national narrative. And we think the only way that we get to different outcomes that actually create for us effective government is actually by naming race. We see these two things as inseparable, that advancing racial equity is the only way we actually get to effective government and the idea of an effective democracy, and that the only way we get to effective democracy is by advancing racial equity. They are at the core of how our nation was constructed. And there's so much more we could say about that, but we're not. Here's a couple of examples of wanting to share what different outcomes could look like. So worked in the city of Seattle for 6 years before working nationally. Managed the city's race and social justice initiative. The initiative itself actually really focused on, well, everything we've been talking about. And every 2 years we surveyed government employees to ask them about their ideas about race and how they were holding this idea of the institution taking on a different role. We had 10,000 city employees, 5,000 volunteered every 2 years to take a 50-question survey. Got some really amazing information from it. One is 86% of the city employees said that examining the impact of race at work was critical. Second one, this took a little bit of time, but 66% said they are actively promoting race and social justice changes in the workplace. So over 3,500 employees saying, I want to make this a part of how I do my business on a regular basis. Finally, about 60% felt like they were making progress in the city or within their department. We did a similar survey for community. 90% of folks said racial equity should be a core responsibility of government. 60% said that thought the city was making progress on this set of issues. And then we asked questions like, how is our schools doing? Only 50% of folks thought. The one I want to name here just really quickly, because I think it's a good example, is we also asked the question, are you comfortable in talking about race? 90% of people said yes. And then we followed up with another question, which is your neighbor talking about race? And what percentage of people said no? 90% of people. I'm good, neighbor not so good, right? That is the context, again, that we sit in this national conversation. How do we actually move beyond a conversation that we all want to have, but we're all afraid to have, right? So, creating structural change. One thing, in the city of Seattle, we created a racial equity tool that we used in all budget decisions and now in the majority of policy decisions in the city. Every year, there's over 2,000 budget decisions that are made, and every one of them has to answer the question, what are the racial equity implications of this work, and what are any unintended consequences? We have changed literally hundreds of policies. Everything from restrictions on criminal background checks to folks with me sort of ban the box. I wish we had more time to talk, but maybe we can get to some of this in questions. We actually made breastfeeding a protected class, protected civil rights class, recognizing that there's profound racial inequities based on people's access to breastfeeding, based on race, just that simple. We tripled contracting goods and services for women and minority-owned businesses after having to deal with the elimination of affirmative action in the state. And I just want to give this last example. So many stories could tell, but it's an important one. If anyone had said to me that the most profound example of racial equity that I would come across in my adult life, especially working in a place like government, would be streetlights, I would have been profoundly confused. So a few years back, we had 5 young people die within the span of maybe 3 months. I think the oldest was 15 years old as a result of gun violence. And the mayor at the time was deeply concerned. He said, I want to know what's going on in the neighborhood. Did a classic mayor move, got in a van, put a bunch of city staff in the van with him, went out on a nighttime drive into southeast Seattle, which is lowest income community in Seattle. It's half the folks are poor, about 80% people of color, about 40% immigrant refugees. Driving down the major thoroughfare, and he notices that a street light's out, and he says, what's up with that? And the person from City Light's like, I'm on it, I'll find out. And he does, to his credit. And they actually use racial equity tool. They send out a group of folks who change bulbs, and they come back, and what they find out is that there's 80 street lights out, right, 80. And I can tell you right now, in the city of Seattle, you won't find any area with 80 street lights out. And so the question was why? Turns out Seattle used the system for many years, many places did, which is simply this, that streetlights got replaced. You were supposed to call when your bulb burnt out. So your bulb burns out in front of your business, your house, that little number on the pole, you're supposed to call the city and say, pole number 5225 is out, and then the city comes out and changes the bulb. Why wouldn't that work in a community that's 80% people of color, more than half of whom are poor, and 40% immigrant and refugees? Say that?
Vacant lots.
Vacant lots?
Could be vacant lots.
Vacant lots, absolutely. Because we don't call it government. It's right. Trust, what else? Language barriers. You all got it. I mean, in 30 seconds, we came up with a bunch of reasons why that is an odd system to imagine that it would work for this community. And in fact, that's all folks did. Sat down and asked these questions and said, yeah, how would that work for this community? Made a really simple change. Turns out light bulbs burn out. They have a life expectancy. You know, who'd have guessed? And so, put a light bulb in, 2 or 3 years later, you come back and replace it, whether it's burnt out yet or not, and voila, you've got lights. Turns out that not only did that make sure that folks had lights, it's actually cheaper than running around all across the city trying to figure out which pole was burnt out, right? So saving money. Also turns out that streetlights are the #1 thing we tell communities that they can do for environmental safety. So it wasn't just a light issue, it was a public safety issue in the most high crime neighborhood in the city. So the mayor gets this and he's like, this is amazing, right? This is fantastic. What other systems do we have that are complaint-based? And folks are like, everything. Right? We're government. So we went through system by system, and it turns out it didn't matter if we were talking garbage pickup, water shutoffs, it didn't matter. There's a disparity. And almost all of them were driven in some way or another by complaint-based systems, right? It turns out that even 911 is a complaint-based system. Don't think about it that way, but it's how it works. It's the north end of Seattle, University of Washington, University District, had as many phone calls to the police department as the south end, our most high crime neighborhood. What were the calls from the University District about to the police? Loud partying, noise. There's noise complaints. So we were getting as many calls from the University of Washington as we were our highest crime neighborhood. We were putting, therefore, as many police officers in the University of Washington as we were in our highest crime neighborhoods even though the calls in the University of Washington were noisy. So we changed it. Like, turns out that actually what people are calling about shouldn't matter. All of this is to say that when well, let me just end with this simple fact. Change the streetlights led to all these profound changes across the system. Who called the city to thank the city for changing the streetlight system? White folks on the north end of the city. Called up lots of them. Thank you so much, I was tired of calling you. Right? Goes back to the bathroom story. It turns out that when a system's fundamentally not working, it's fundamentally not working. Just some folks have more resources, more access to figure out how to make it work for them. But it turns out it's not really a functioning system. So really, when we think about how we get to different outcomes, at the end of the day, all we're really saying is we need to ask ourselves who's benefiting and who's burdened by the decisions we're making. Pretty simple, right? And we need to recognize that when we come up with systems that fundamentally work for those who are most vulnerable in our communities, we are coming up with systems that work better for all of us. And I just want to say thank you for giving me your time.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a thought that I'd like to get from you. A couple of weeks ago, I live in Conyers, Georgia, and that's a suburb of Atlanta. A couple of weeks ago or a month or two ago, our police chief got on the news and said that they were recruiting more officers that were African American or of Hispanic descent. Well, initially, some friends and I were sitting around the TV when that was aired. Initially, the reaction was, what? But they elaborated more on why they were doing that, and based off of his saying of the census reports and statistics had stated that they had outgrown, their policies had outgrown and were old and pretty much depleting of the customers they were now serving. The census had reported that they had in a 10-year span increased in Hispanic and African American 236%. So they were going to take an adjustment to be able to say, we need to grow with our customers. We need to change our process to be able to serve our clientele and understand the cultural behaviors and how we can serve them better. Do you think that was an excellent idea to be able to start building the processes that we have spoken about as far as bridging gaps and where the public can start to gain trust because you have people who are more understanding of some of the social issues to be able to say, not go in with a prejudge of, oh my God, do I need to call for backup? Do I need to have a problem where, I already see this guy's a problem when you haven't even really heard the situation first. So don't you think that's more of a proactive measure to be able to kind of mend fences?
I do. So it's a great question, and Ferguson's a really good example of this too, right? Rapidly, everybody in this room knows this. Neighborhoods are changing pretty quick across the country, right? But I would say in general, one of the really important things is that police departments being reflective of the community is a really important first step. I will share that there are places that are more reflective of community and police representation, and the issues that we've seen don't disappear. And so again, I think it's a really important piece. I think it's critical, just to be clear. And it turns out that institutions are much more likely to predict how people engage in the world than individuals. And it's such a hard thing. It's one of those things that we have really hard time wrapping our minds around. But the reality is most of us will come to reflect the institution we're in, not change it. And so that piece is, I think, still the challenge. And so things like implicit bias training, things like more meaningful community engagement and participation in community, those pieces around how do we also think about culture change within those institutions are critical, just to say. One more? One more?
Glenn, thank you. My name is Daryl Armstrong from Trent, New Jersey.
Hey, Daryl.
And the first thing I'm going to do, I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old. I'm going to go home, and for every time they say Denmark, I'm going to say Djibouti 10 more times to my 10-year-old and my 9-year-old. I'm a kangaroo orange Denmark guy. We're not proud to say it, but I was trying to think of a country in Africa. I couldn't get to Djibouti. But my question is, certainly understanding and believing and even studying the construct of race, knowing that it's a construct that we created within the last several centuries, how am I to think about millennia and centuries of bias against other groups? Mm-hmm. So Constantine was converted in 312.
That's right.
In his battle against the barbarians. Yeah. 836 AD, governor in the Cantonese province passed a law that says Chinese can't intermarry with these dark-skinned people. I visited Rome and saw the wall that separated civilized Rome from barbarians. How am I to think about Attila the Hun? So right. All of these other people groups, yeah. Race as we understand it is 400 years old.
Yep.
What did they call implicit bias a millennia ago?
Yeah, that's it. They didn't call it anything, but they had it.
They had it.
Right. And so to be clear, I mean, thank you for asking that question. This comes up a lot as a question, right, about, so why race? And it turns out that we are really good at being cruel to each other. And we've come up with systems for doing it repeatedly throughout history. It just turns out that in the United States, our brand of that is race. That's why race, right? It's not that it's unique, to your point. It's not that what's unique about it is that it's ours, that we created this one, right? And I think the reason that's important is because, A, it is a construct, right? This is the one we made. It means we can unmake it. It means that we can change it. And I think one of the grand challenges for us to this point is getting past the guilt of it, getting past the shame of it, getting past the anger of it, and really centering a conversation about, are we building the communities in the country we want to live in? And I will just say to this point, I said it earlier, but I deeply believe it, I don't believe we can unless we center race. We've been at it. I would just maybe flip it in this way. We've been at it talking about all of these things for at least the last 50 years, 70 years. And it seems to me every time we move away, we talk about class, we talk about equity without naming race, we talk about it in every way possible, and I would put out that we are still stuck with the same numbers. So maybe just once, we might think about centering it and holding it and seeing what happens. I think there's real possibility.